In the heart of southern Africa, where the wind whispers through ancient granite hills and the earth holds secrets that have slumbered for centuries, stands one of humanity's most magnificent mysteries. Picture towering stone walls rising from the African soil, built without mortar, without machinery, without any of the tools we might expect from such an architectural marvel. These walls have stood for nearly 1,000 years, their secrets locked away like treasures in a vault that time itself forgot to open. This is Great Zimbabwe, and tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I'm going to take you on a journey through one of Africa's greatest civilizations. A story that begins with humble farmers and ends with an empire that controlled the gold trade across an entire continent. A tale of innovation, prosperity, mystery, and ultimately abandonment that would puzzle archaeologists for generations to come. But here's what makes this story truly captivating. For centuries, the Western world refused to believe that Africans could have built something so magnificent. They invented elaborate theories about Phoenicians, Arabs, even biblical figures creating these structures. They couldn't accept that indigenous African peoples had engineered one of the world's most sophisticated stone cities. Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth that was hidden for so long. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how a small farming community grew into an empire that stretched across modern-day Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Mozambique. You'll discover the ingenious engineering techniques that allowed builders to create walls that have survived earthquakes, floods, and nearly a millennium of weather. Most importantly, you'll learn about the remarkable people who called this place home, their daily lives, their beliefs, and the forces that eventually led them to abandon their stone city forever. But this isn't just a story about the past. Great Zimbabwe challenges everything we think we know about African history, about human innovation, and about the civilizations that flourished long before European contact. The techniques developed here influenced architecture across southern Africa. The trade networks established by these people connected the African interior to the Indian Ocean, bringing goods from as far away as China and Persia to this remote plateau. I've spent countless hours researching this story, diving deep into archaeological reports, historical accounts, and the latest discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of this incredible civilization. What you're about to hear isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's a human story about ambition, innovation, and the eternal mystery of why great civilizations sometimes simply fade away. The name Zimbabwe itself means stone houses or venerated houses in the local Shona language. But the people who built this place called it something else entirely. They knew it as the seat of power, the heart of an empire, the place where the ancestors spoke to the living through the stones themselves. Tonight, we're going to walk through those same stones, breathe the same air, and try to understand what life was like in this remarkable place. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me transport you back nearly 1,000 years to a time when Great Zimbabwe was the beating heart of southern Africa's most powerful empire. A time when the sound of hammers on stone echoed across the granite hills, when traders from distant lands climbed these heights carrying precious goods, and when the rulers of this great city commanded respect across a territory larger than modern-day France. Our story begins not with the massive stone walls that made Great Zimbabwe famous, but with something far more humble. Around the year 1000 CE, long before the first stones were carefully placed atop one another, this region was home to scattered communities of Bantu-speaking farmers who had been slowly migrating southward for centuries. These weren't nomadic peoples. They were skilled agriculturalists who understood the rhythms of the African seasons, who knew which crops would thrive in different soils, and who had developed sophisticated techniques for working iron and raising cattle. The location that would become Great Zimbabwe wasn't chosen by accident. Picture this landscape as it existed 1,000 years ago. Rolling granite hills covered in dense woodland, with clear streams flowing between rocky outcrops. The soil was fertile, perfect for growing sorghum and millet. The climate was temperate, with reliable rainfall during the wet season and mild, dry winters. Most importantly, this region sat at the intersection of two crucial trade routes. One connected the gold fields of the interior to the coastal ports of the Indian Ocean. The other linked the cattle-rich grasslands of the south to the copper mines of the north. The early inhabitants of this area lived in small villages, each consisting of perhaps 50 to 100 people. Their homes were simple but effective, circular structures built with mud brick walls and thatched roofs. They kept cattle, which served not just as a source of food, but as symbols of wealth and status. A man's standing in the community was often measured by the size of his herd. They cultivated crops using iron tools that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Archaeological evidence shows that these early farmers were producing high-quality iron implements, from farming tools to weapons to intricate decorative objects. But what transformed this peaceful farming region into the foundation of an empire was gold. Not far from the granite hills that would host Great Zimbabwe lay some of the richest gold deposits in all of Africa. These weren't deep mines requiring complex equipment. The gold here lay close to the surface, accessible through simple excavation techniques that communities had been using for generations. The local people had been working these deposits for centuries, but on a small scale, primarily for decorative purposes and local trade. Everything changed when Arab and Persian traders began establishing permanent settlements along the East African coast. Cities like Kilwa, Mogadishu, and Sofala became bustling commercial centers where goods from the African interior met merchants from across the Indian Ocean. These coastal traders had access to markets that stretched from India to China, and they were hungry for two things Africa could provide in abundance: gold and ivory. The demand for gold created an opportunity that the farming communities near what would become Great Zimbabwe were perfectly positioned to exploit. They controlled access to the gold fields. They had the agricultural surplus to support larger populations. They possessed the iron-working skills necessary for mining and defense. Most crucially, they had cattle, which could be used both for transport and as a store of wealth that could be converted into trade goods when needed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For nearly 2 centuries, from around 1000 to 1200 CE, the communities in this region gradually grew more prosperous and more interconnected. Villages began specializing in different activities. Some focused on gold mining and processing. Others concentrated on cattle raising or agriculture. Still others became centers for ironworking or pottery production. This specialization created trade networks that connected communities across hundreds of miles. As wealth accumulated, social hierarchies began to emerge. The most successful farmers and cattle owners started to distinguish themselves from their neighbors. They built larger homes, acquired more wives, and began to command the labor of others. This wasn't simply about personal enrichment. In African societies, wealth carried obligations. A prosperous man was expected to provide for his extended family, to help his neighbors in times of need, and to contribute to community projects. But he was also entitled to respect, deference, and political influence. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of increasing social stratification. Excavations reveal that by 1200 CE, some homesteads were significantly larger and more elaborate than others. The pottery becomes more sophisticated, with clear distinctions between everyday vessels and luxury items clearly meant for display. Ironworking reaches new levels of refinement, producing not just tools, but intricate jewelry and ceremonial objects. Most tellingly, this is when we first see evidence of stone construction in the region. Not the massive walls that would make Great Zimbabwe famous, but smaller stone enclosures, terraces, and foundations. These early stone structures weren't built for defense. They were statements of status, ways for wealthy families to demonstrate their prosperity and permanence. Building with stone required enormous investments of time and labor. It showed that a family had resources to spare, that they could afford to have workers spend months carefully selecting, shaping, and placing stones when they could have been farming or herding cattle. The technique these early builders developed would become the foundation for everything that followed. They learned to work with the natural properties of the local granite, which splits along predictable lines when heated and cooled. They discovered how to select stones that would fit together perfectly without mortar, creating walls that were not only beautiful but incredibly strong. They developed methods for moving massive stones up steep hillsides using nothing but human labor, wooden rollers, and an intimate understanding of leverage and physics. By 1200 CE, several small stone-walled settlements dotted the landscape around what would become Great Zimbabwe. Each was the home of a prosperous extended family or small clan. These weren't defensive structures in the traditional sense. The walls were too low and had too many openings to keep out determined attackers. Instead, they served multiple purposes. They marked territory, showing clearly where one family's land ended and another's began. They provided privacy, creating enclosed spaces where important ceremonies and discussions could take place away from prying eyes. They demonstrated wealth and status, showing that the inhabitants had the resources to undertake such ambitious construction projects. Most importantly, these early stone structures were connected to spiritual beliefs that would become central to the culture of Great Zimbabwe. The local people believed that their ancestors continued to exist after death, that they could influence events in the world of the living, and that they were particularly associated with specific places and natural features. Granite hills and rocky outcrops were seen as especially sacred, places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors was thin. Building stone walls on these sacred hills wasn't just about demonstrating wealth or marking territory. It was about creating a connection with the ancestors, about establishing a family's spiritual as well as temporal authority over a particular place. The stones themselves were believed to hold power, to be imbued with the presence of those who had gone before. This spiritual dimension of stone construction would become increasingly important as the settlement grew larger and more complex. As the 13th century dawned, all the elements were in place for something unprecedented in the history of southern Africa. The trade networks were established, connecting the gold fields to the coastal ports. The agricultural base was strong enough to support large populations. The social hierarchies had developed to the point where powerful leaders could command the labor of hundreds of people. The building techniques had been perfected through generations of experimentation. Most importantly, the spiritual and cultural framework existed to justify and sustain the construction of something truly magnificent. The stage was set for the rise of Great Zimbabwe, the stone city that would become the heart of southern Africa's greatest indigenous empire. But the story of how a collection of prosperous farming villages transformed into a regional superpower is one that involves not just economics and politics, but religion, innovation, and the dreams of people who dared to build something that would outlast their own lifetimes. The transformation of this landscape from scattered farming communities to the seat of a great empire began with a single visionary leader whose name has been lost to history, but whose legacy is written in stone across the hills of Zimbabwe. Around 1220 CE, someone made a decision that would change the course of southern African history forever. They chose to build not just another family compound, but something unprecedented in scale and ambition. This unknown leader understood something that would prove crucial to the rise of Great Zimbabwe. Location wasn't just about access to gold or trade routes, though both were important. It was about creating a center of power that could be seen from miles away, that would draw people from across the region, and that would serve as a permanent symbol of authority and prosperity. The hill they chose rose nearly 300 feet above the surrounding valley, its granite slopes dotted with massive boulders that seemed placed there by the gods themselves. But this wasn't simply a matter of picking the highest hill and starting to build. The site they selected was already sacred to the local people, a place where important ceremonies had been conducted for generations. The granite formations created natural enclosures and passages that were believed to be pathways for the ancestors. Springs emerged from the rocks, providing fresh water even during the driest seasons. The hill commanded views in every direction, allowing observers to spot approaching traders, messengers, or potential threats from miles away. The decision to build on this particular hill was both practical and deeply spiritual. In the worldview of these people, political power and religious authority were inseparable. A ruler wasn't just someone who controlled resources or commanded armies. They were an intermediary between the living and the dead, someone who could communicate with the ancestors and ensure their continued protection of the community. By building on this sacred hill, the leaders of early Great Zimbabwe were making a statement that their authority came not just from wealth or military strength, but from divine sanction. The construction that began around 1220 CE was unlike anything previously attempted in the region. Where earlier stone structures had been relatively small, enclosing perhaps a single homestead or ceremonial area, this new project was vast in scope. The builders began by creating a series of terraces and enclosures that followed the natural contours of the hill, using the existing granite formations as foundations for their walls. The technique they employed was deceptively simple, but required enormous skill to execute properly. They selected granite blocks that had been naturally shaped by centuries of weathering, fitting them together like pieces of an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. No mortar was used. Instead, the walls relied on the precise placement of each stone, the weight of the blocks above pressing down to create structures of remarkable stability. The largest stones, some weighing several tons, were placed at the bottom of each wall. As the wall rose higher, progressively smaller stones were used, creating structures that were both strong and aesthetically pleasing. What made this construction technique so remarkable wasn't just its effectiveness, but its sustainability. The builders worked with the natural properties of the granite rather than against them. They understood how the stone split, how it weathered, and how it could be shaped without expensive tools or complex machinery. The walls they created would flex slightly with changes in temperature and humidity, preventing the kind of cracking that destroys mortared structures over time. Even earthquakes, which periodically shake this region, couldn't topple walls that were essentially piles of carefully balanced stones. The early phases of construction focused on the hilltop, creating what archaeologists now call the hill complex. This area served multiple functions. It was the residence of the ruler and his immediate family. It was a ceremonial center where important rituals were conducted. It was a fortress that could be defended if necessary. And it was a symbol, visible from great distances, that announced to everyone in the region that something new and powerful had arrived. The hill complex wasn't built all at once. Archaeological evidence suggests that construction continued for decades, with new walls and enclosures added as the settlement grew more prosperous and the ruler's power expanded. Each new addition followed the same basic principles, but the structures became increasingly sophisticated over time. Later walls show evidence of more advanced planning, with drainage systems built into their foundations and decorative elements incorporated into their design. As word of this remarkable construction project spread, people began arriving from across the region. Some came as traders, drawn by reports of wealth and opportunity. Others came as craftspeople, offering their skills in exchange for a share of the prosperity. Still others came as laborers, willing to work on the construction in exchange for food, protection, and the chance to be part of something unprecedented. The population of the settlement grew rapidly. By 1250 CE, several thousand people were living in and around the stone structures on the hill. This created new challenges that the rulers had to address. How do you feed several thousand people in a region that had previously supported only scattered farming villages? How do you organize their labor effectively? How do you maintain order and resolve disputes among people from different communities with different traditions? The solutions they developed would become the foundation of Great Zimbabwe's political and economic system. Agriculture was intensified through the construction of terraces and irrigation systems that allowed crops to be grown on previously unusable hillsides. Cattle herds were expanded to provide both food and wealth. Most importantly, the rulers established a tribute system that required surrounding communities to contribute food, labor, and trade goods in exchange for protection and access to the growing commercial networks. This tribute system was the key to Great Zimbabwe's early success. The rulers didn't try to control every aspect of production in their territory. Instead, they positioned themselves as intermediaries, facilitating trade between different regions and taking a percentage of every transaction. A community that specialized in ironworking might trade their products for cattle from pastoral peoples, with Great Zimbabwe's rulers taking a share of both the iron goods and the cattle in exchange for arranging and protecting the trade. The wealth that flowed into Great Zimbabwe through this system was invested in further construction. Around 1250 CE, work began on what would become the settlement's most famous feature, the great enclosure in the valley below the hill. This massive stone wall, eventually reaching heights of over 30 feet and stretching for more than 800 feet, was the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara Desert. The great enclosure served a different purpose than the hill complex above. While the hilltop remained the ruler's residence and the center of political and religious authority, the valley enclosure became the heart of the settlement's economic and social life. Within its walls lived the craftspeople, traders, and administrators who kept the growing city functioning. Here were the workshops where gold was processed, iron was worked, and pottery was created. Here were the markets where goods from across southern Africa were bought and sold. The construction of the great enclosure required a level of organization and planning that demonstrated how sophisticated Great Zimbabwe's society had become. The wall alone required an estimated 900,000 granite blocks, each carefully selected, shaped, and fitted into place. The labor force needed to complete such a project would have numbered in the thousands, all of whom had to be fed, housed, and coordinated over a construction period that lasted several decades. But the great enclosure was more than just an impressive wall. Archaeological excavations have revealed a complex internal structure of smaller enclosures, platforms, and passages that suggest careful planning for different activities and social groups. Some areas appear to have been residential quarters for elite families. Others were clearly workshops or storage areas. Still others seem to have been ceremonial spaces where important community rituals were conducted. The most mysterious feature of the Great Enclosure is the conical tower, a solid stone structure that rises nearly 30 feet from the ground and serves no apparent practical purpose. It has no internal chambers, no stairs, and no obvious function as either a defensive structure or a storage facility. Instead, it appears to be purely symbolic, a massive stone monument whose meaning remains one of Great Zimbabwe's greatest puzzles. Some scholars believe the conical tower represents a grain bin, symbolizing the agricultural abundance that supported the city's prosperity. Others suggest it might be a representation of a royal ancestor or a symbol of the ruler's authority. Still others think it might be connected to astronomical observations or seasonal ceremonies. The truth is that we may never know exactly what the conical tower meant to the people who built it, but its presence demonstrates the importance they placed on creating structures that served spiritual and symbolic purposes, as well as practical ones. By 1300 CE, Great Zimbabwe had become the undisputed center of power in southern Africa. The population had grown to an estimated 18,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The stone walls enclosed an area of nearly 1,800 acres, with additional settlements spreading for miles in every direction. The tribute system had evolved into a sophisticated network that connected communities across modern-day Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique, and parts of South Africa. Chatsitram. The wealth flowing through Great Zimbabwe was staggering by medieval standards. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of trade goods from across the known world. Chinese porcelain and Persian ceramics were found alongside locally made pottery. Glass beads from India and the Middle East were discovered in the same layers as African ivory and gold ornaments. Copper from the mines of what is now Zambia was worked alongside iron from local deposits to create alloys of remarkable quality. This international trade was facilitated by the settlement's position at the center of multiple trade networks. Gold from the nearby fields was processed in Great Zimbabwe's workshops before being transported to the coastal ports for export. Ivory from elephants hunted in the surrounding regions was carved and prepared for overseas markets. In return, luxury goods from Asia and the Middle East flowed back to Great Zimbabwe, where they were redistributed to allied communities throughout the interior. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe had created something unprecedented in southern Africa, a true urban center that served as the hub of a regional economy. But this wasn't simply about accumulating wealth for its own sake. The prosperity of Great Zimbabwe supported a flowering of culture and innovation that influenced the entire region. The architectural techniques developed here spread to other communities, leading to the construction of similar stone settlements throughout what is now Zimbabwe and neighboring countries. The political system that emerged at Great Zimbabwe was equally influential. The combination of sacred authority, economic control, and military power that the rulers wielded became a model that other African societies would adopt and adapt. The tribute system they developed showed how a central authority could maintain control over a large territory without the need for a permanent standing army or a massive bureaucracy. As the 14th century dawned, Great Zimbabwe stood at the height of its power and influence. The stone city had become a magnet that drew people, goods, and ideas from across southern Africa and beyond. The walls that had begun as a single leader's ambitious dream had grown into the foundation of an empire that stretched across thousands of square miles and influenced the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. But even at this moment of triumph, the seeds of future challenges were already being sown. The very success that had made Great Zimbabwe great was beginning to create problems that would test the resilience of this remarkable civilization. The story of how the greatest indigenous city in southern Africa dealt with these challenges and ultimately succumbed to them is a tale of human ambition, environmental pressure, and the eternal struggle between growth and sustainability. The prosperity that had made Great Zimbabwe the jewel of southern Africa was about to face its greatest test. By 1350 CE, the stone city had grown beyond anything its founders could have imagined. What had begun as a single hilltop settlement now sprawled across miles of granite hills and fertile valleys. The population had swelled to nearly 20,000 inhabitants, making it larger than London or Paris at the time. But with this growth came pressures that would challenge every aspect of the civilization that had taken centuries to build. The first signs of strain appeared in the most fundamental area of any society: food production. The agricultural system that had sustained Great Zimbabwe's early growth was beginning to buckle under the weight of feeding such a massive population. The fertile soils around the city, once capable of producing abundant harvests of sorghum and millet, were showing signs of exhaustion after generations of intensive cultivation. The natural cycle of fallowing that had allowed the land to recover between plantings became impossible when every available acre was needed to feed the growing city. The rulers responded to this challenge with characteristic ingenuity. They expanded the network of agricultural terraces that climbed the hillsides around the settlement, creating new farmland where none had existed before. Stone-lined channels carried water from mountain springs to irrigate crops during the dry season. Storage facilities were built to preserve grain surpluses from good harvests to carry the population through leaner years. These weren't simple solutions implemented by farmers working their own land. They were massive public works projects that required the coordination of thousands of workers and represented investments that would take years to pay off. But even these ambitious agricultural expansions couldn't keep pace with the city's growth. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing reliance on food imports from communities hundreds of miles away. Tribute payments that had once consisted primarily of luxury goods and raw materials now included substantial quantities of grain and dried meat. The transportation networks that had been developed to move gold and ivory were pressed into service carrying the basic necessities of life. This shift had profound implications for Great Zimbabwe's political structure. The rulers found themselves increasingly dependent on the goodwill of distant communities to feed their own people. The tribute system that had once been based on mutual benefit began to feel more like exploitation as outlying settlements were pressed to contribute ever larger quantities of food while receiving diminishing returns in the form of trade opportunities and protection. The strain on food production was compounded by environmental changes that were affecting the entire region. Tree ring data and lake sediment cores from this period suggest that southern Africa was experiencing a gradual shift toward drier conditions. The reliable rainfall that had supported the expansion of agriculture was becoming less predictable. Droughts that had once been rare events began occurring with increasing frequency. The springs that provided water to the city during dry seasons started flowing less reliably. These environmental pressures affected more than just agriculture. The vast herds of cattle that had been central to Great Zimbabwe's wealth and prestige required enormous amounts of grazing land and water. As the climate became more arid, the carrying capacity of the surrounding grasslands declined. Herders were forced to drive their cattle farther and farther from the city in search of adequate pasture, making them more vulnerable to raids from neighboring communities and wild predators. The cattle herds were more than just economic assets. In the culture of Great Zimbabwe, cattle represented social status, spiritual connection to the ancestors, and political power. A ruler's legitimacy was partly measured by the size of his herds and his ability to distribute cattle to his followers. As environmental pressures made it more difficult to maintain large herds, the traditional foundations of political authority began to erode. The economic pressures facing Great Zimbabwe were intensified by changes in the international trade networks that had made the city wealthy. The coastal ports that had served as gateways for Great Zimbabwe's gold and ivory were facing increased competition from other trading centers. New gold discoveries in other parts of Africa were beginning to compete with the deposits controlled by Great Zimbabwe. Most significantly, the political situation along the coast was becoming increasingly unstable as different trading cities fought for control of the lucrative Indian Ocean commerce. These external pressures forced Great Zimbabwe's rulers to adapt their trading strategies. They began sending their own trading expeditions to the coast, rather than relying entirely on coastal merchants to come to them. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that Great Zimbabwe established permanent trading posts at several coastal locations, creating a more direct connection to international markets. But this expansion required resources and manpower that strained the city's already stretched capabilities. The internal structure of Great Zimbabwe's society was also evolving in response to these pressures. The original ruling family that had built the hill complex was no longer the only source of political power in the city. Wealthy merchant families, successful craftspeople, and the leaders of important trading expeditions had accumulated enough resources to challenge the traditional hierarchy. New stone enclosures were built throughout the settlement, each representing a different power center with its own followers and interests. This proliferation of competing elites created a more complex, but also more unstable political environment. Decisions that had once been made by a single ruler and his advisors now required negotiation among multiple factions with different priorities. The consensus that had enabled Great Zimbabwe's early expansion became harder to maintain as different groups pursued conflicting strategies for dealing with the city's challenges. The religious and spiritual life of Great Zimbabwe was also affected by these changes. The traditional beliefs that had connected political authority to communication with the ancestors remained strong, but they were being supplemented by new spiritual practices that reflected the city's cosmopolitan character. Traders and immigrants brought religious ideas from across southern Africa and beyond. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of ceremonial practices that appear to blend local traditions with influences from as far away as the Swahili coast. The most visible sign of these changing spiritual practices was the construction of new ceremonial structures within the great enclosure. These weren't built according to the traditional principles that had guided earlier construction. Instead, they incorporated decorative elements and architectural features that suggested influence from other cultures. Some scholars interpret these changes as evidence of religious innovation and cultural synthesis. Others see them as signs that Great Zimbabwe was losing its distinctive identity as it became more integrated with wider trade networks. Despite these growing pressures, the daily life of ordinary people in Great Zimbabwe continued to follow patterns that had been established over generations. Archaeological evidence from residential areas shows that most families lived in circular huts built with traditional materials and techniques. They cooked their meals in pottery vessels that were made using methods passed down through families for centuries. They wore clothing made from locally woven textiles and decorated themselves with jewelry created in the city's workshops. But even in these everyday activities, signs of change were visible. The pottery from this period shows increasing standardization, suggesting that production was becoming more centralized and commercialized. The jewelry includes more items made from imported materials, reflecting the city's continued integration with international trade networks. Most tellingly, the residential areas show evidence of increasing social stratification, with clear differences between the homes of wealthy families and those of ordinary workers. The workshops that had been central to Great Zimbabwe's prosperity were adapting to changing conditions with characteristic innovation. Gold processing techniques became more sophisticated as the easily accessible deposits near the city were exhausted, and miners had to work deeper and more remote sites. Ironworking evolved to produce not just tools and weapons, but increasingly complex decorative objects that demonstrated the skill of the city's craftspeople. Pottery production expanded to include items clearly intended for export, suggesting that Great Zimbabwe was beginning to compete in markets that had previously been dominated by coastal manufacturers. The architecture of the city itself continued to evolve during this period. New walls and enclosures were built using techniques that had been refined over generations of construction. But the scale of these projects was generally smaller than the massive undertakings of earlier centuries. Resources that had once been devoted to monumental construction were increasingly directed toward more practical concerns, like food storage, water management, and defensive preparations. The defensive preparations are particularly telling because they suggest that Great Zimbabwe's rulers were becoming concerned about external threats. Earlier construction had focused primarily on creating impressive displays of wealth and power. The walls were tall and beautiful, but they had many openings and weren't designed primarily for military defense. The later construction shows evidence of more serious attention to defensive considerations, with fewer entrances, higher walls, and more strategic positioning of guard posts. These defensive concerns weren't paranoid fantasies. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing evidence of conflict throughout the region. Settlements that had been peaceful trading partners for generations were fortifying themselves against raids. Trade routes that had been secure for centuries were becoming dangerous. The political stability that had enabled Great Zimbabwe's rise was beginning to break down as environmental and economic pressures created competition for increasingly scarce resources. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe responded to these challenges with a combination of military expansion and diplomatic negotiation. They established new outposts in strategic locations to protect trade routes and assert control over important resources. They negotiated new alliances with communities that had previously been independent. They invested heavily in military equipment and training, creating what may have been Southern Africa's first professional army. But these responses, while rational and well executed, couldn't address the fundamental problem facing Great Zimbabwe. The city had grown beyond the carrying capacity of its local environment. The agricultural and pastoral systems that had supported its early expansion were no longer adequate for its current population. The trade networks that had generated its wealth were facing competition and instability that threatened future prosperity. Most critically, the political and social systems that had enabled its remarkable growth were struggling to adapt to changing conditions. By 1400 CE, these pressures were beginning to create visible cracks in Great Zimbabwe's facade of prosperity and power. The population was starting to decline as families left the city in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Some of the outer settlements were being abandoned as their inhabitants moved closer to the main defensive walls. The tribute system was breaking down as outlying communities became less willing or able to contribute to the city's support. The archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of a civilization under stress, but still functioning, still innovating, still adapting to changing conditions. The people of Great Zimbabwe weren't passive victims of forces beyond their control. They were actively working to solve the problems facing their society. But they were also discovering the harsh reality that some challenges are too large and too complex for any single community to overcome, no matter how wealthy, sophisticated, or determined it might be. The stage was being set for one of history's most intriguing mysteries: the gradual abandonment of one of Africa's greatest cities by the very people who had spent centuries building it. The story of how and why Great Zimbabwe was eventually abandoned reveals as much about human resilience and adaptability as it does about the limits of what any civilization can achieve. It's a story that would puzzle archaeologists for generations and challenge every assumption about Africa's historical development. As the 15th century unfolded, the magnificent stone city that had dominated southern Africa for nearly 3 centuries began to experience changes that would ultimately transform it from a bustling metropolis into an archaeological mystery. The decline of Great Zimbabwe wasn't a sudden collapse marked by invasion or natural disaster. Instead, it was a gradual transformation that unfolded over several generations, as the people who had built this remarkable civilization made increasingly difficult decisions about their future. The first major shift came in the settlement patterns around the city itself. Archaeological evidence from the early 1400s shows that many of the outer residential areas were being systematically abandoned. Families who had lived for generations in the shadow of the great stone walls began moving away, some traveling only a few miles to establish new homesteads, others journeying hundreds of miles to join relatives in distant communities. This wasn't a panicked exodus. The abandonment was orderly, with valuables carefully removed and structures left intact rather than destroyed. What drove these population movements was a complex interplay of environmental, economic, and political factors that had been building for decades. The agricultural crisis that had begun to affect the region in the late 14th century was intensifying. The soils around Great Zimbabwe, exhausted by centuries of intensive cultivation, were producing diminishing yields despite the terracing and irrigation systems that had been built to support them. The climate was becoming increasingly unpredictable, with droughts occurring more frequently and lasting longer than anyone could remember. The cattle herds that had been central to the city's wealth and prestige were facing even more severe pressures. The grasslands that had once supported tens of thousands of animals were deteriorating under the combined stress of overgrazing and changing rainfall patterns. Herders found themselves driving their animals farther and farther from the city in search of adequate pasture, sometimes traveling for weeks to reach areas where the grass was sufficient to sustain their herds through the dry season. This dispersal of the cattle herds had profound implications for Great Zimbabwe's political structure. In a society where cattle represented not just economic wealth, but political power and spiritual connection to the ancestors, the inability to maintain large centralized herds undermined the traditional basis of authority. Local chiefs who controlled good grazing lands hundreds of miles from the stone city found themselves in increasingly powerful positions relative to the rulers who remained behind the walls. The international trade networks that had made Great Zimbabwe wealthy were also undergoing fundamental changes. New gold discoveries in other parts of southern Africa were competing with the deposits that Great Zimbabwe had controlled for centuries. The coastal trading cities were developing direct relationships with these new sources of gold, bypassing the established networks that had funneled wealth through the stone city. Portuguese explorers were beginning to establish trading posts along the coast, introducing new political and economic dynamics that would eventually reshape the entire region. Perhaps most significantly, the very success of Great Zimbabwe's architectural and political innovations was creating new centers of power throughout the region. Communities that had learned stone-building techniques from Great Zimbabwe's craftsmen were constructing their own impressive settlements. The tributary chiefs, who had once acknowledged the supremacy of the stone city's rulers, were discovering that they could command the loyalty of their own people and control their own trade relationships without reference to the central authority. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe recognized these challenges and attempted to respond with characteristic innovation and determination. They established new trading posts closer to the coast, trying to maintain direct control over the export of gold and ivory. They negotiated new alliances with communities that controlled important grazing lands, offering political marriages and military support in exchange for access to pasture for their herds. They even attempted to establish satellite settlements in areas where the environmental conditions were more favorable for agriculture and pastoralism. One of the most ambitious of these responses was the establishment of what archaeologists call the successor sites, new stone-walled settlements built by Great Zimbabwe's rulers or their allies in different parts of the region. Kami, located about 150 miles southwest of Great Zimbabwe, became the most important of these new centers. Built using architectural techniques that clearly derived from Great Zimbabwe, but adapted to different environmental and political conditions, Kami represented an attempt to recreate the success of the original stone city in a more sustainable location. The construction of Kami and other successor sites required enormous investments of labor and resources at a time when Great Zimbabwe was already under stress. The skilled stone masons, the transport animals, and the food supplies needed to support such massive construction projects had to be diverted from other activities. This created a vicious cycle where the responses to Great Zimbabwe's problems actually accelerated the city's decline by draining away the resources and people needed to maintain its existing infrastructure. The social and cultural life of Great Zimbabwe during this period of transition reveals a community that was adapting creatively to changing circumstances while struggling to maintain its distinctive identity. The pottery from this era shows interesting innovations, with new decorative styles that suggest influence from other regions, but also demonstrate continued local creativity. The metalworking traditions continued to evolve, producing objects that were technically sophisticated but stylistically different from earlier periods. The religious and ceremonial life of the community also showed signs of adaptation. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the traditional ceremonies associated with specific locations within the stone enclosures were being modified or relocated as the population dispersed. New shrines were being established in areas where people had moved, but these often incorporated stones and other sacred objects from the original sites, maintaining spiritual continuity even as physical circumstances changed. The daily routines of ordinary families were also evolving in response to changing conditions. Households that had once specialized in particular crafts or trades were becoming more self-sufficient, developing skills in multiple areas as the specialized economy of the peak period gave way to more generalized survival strategies. Gardens that had once produced luxury foods for elite consumption were converted to growing basic subsistence crops. Storage facilities that had held trade goods were repurposed to preserve food against increasingly frequent shortages. One of the most poignant aspects of this period is the evidence for continued construction and maintenance of the stone walls, even as the population was declining. The people who remained in Great Zimbabwe continued to add new sections to existing enclosures and to repair damage from weather and age. This wasn't simply a matter of maintaining existing structures. The archaeological record shows that new walls were being built according to traditional techniques and principles, suggesting that the cultural knowledge and values associated with stone construction remained strong even as the practical circumstances that had originally motivated it were changing. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe wasn't a single event, but a process that unfolded over nearly a century. Different areas of the settlement were abandoned at different times, with the population gradually concentrating in the most defensible and sustainable locations before eventually departing entirely. The hill complex, which had been the original center of power, appears to have been occupied longer than other areas, perhaps because its elevated position and natural water sources made it more viable during periods of stress. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final abandonment of the hill complex occurred sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century. The last inhabitants appear to have left in an orderly fashion, taking their most valuable possessions, but leaving behind pottery, tools, and other everyday objects that provide us with intimate glimpses into their daily lives. There's no evidence of violent destruction or hasty evacuation. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a community that made a deliberate decision to relocate after carefully considering their options. The reasons for this final departure were probably similar to those that had been driving population movements for decades, but intensified to the point where remaining was no longer viable. The agricultural potential of the immediate area had been exhausted. The cattle herds had been moved so far away that maintaining them required permanent residence in distant pastures. The trade networks that had supported the city's economy had shifted to other centers. Most importantly, the political authority that had once drawn people from across the region to acknowledge the supremacy of Great Zimbabwe's rulers had been dispersed among multiple competing centers. The people who left Great Zimbabwe didn't simply disappear. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that they joined existing communities throughout the region or established new settlements in areas with better environmental conditions. Many probably moved to Kami and other successor sites that had been established by Great Zimbabwe's rulers. Others likely returned to the areas where their families had originated before the rise of the Stone City. Still others may have moved to the coast, where new trading opportunities were emerging with the arrival of Portuguese merchants. The cultural and technological innovations that had been developed at Great Zimbabwe continued to influence the region long after the city itself was abandoned. Stone building techniques spread throughout southern Africa, with new settlements constructed according to principles that had been perfected in the granite hills of Zimbabwe. The political and social structures that had been developed to manage the complex society of the Stone City were adapted and modified by communities across the region. The agricultural and pastoral techniques that had supported Great Zimbabwe's population continued to be used and refined by farmers and herders throughout southern Africa. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe marked the end of one of Africa's most remarkable urban experiments. But it wasn't the end of the civilization that had created it. The people who had built the stone walls and established the trade networks that connected the African interior to the Indian Ocean carried their knowledge, skills, and cultural values with them to new locations. They continued to build, to trade, to innovate, and to create communities that reflected the lessons they had learned during the centuries when Great Zimbabwe stood as the greatest city in southern Africa. The mystery of Great Zimbabwe's abandonment has fascinated archaeologists and historians for generations. But perhaps the real mystery isn't why the city was eventually abandoned, but how it managed to thrive for so long in an environment that posed such fundamental challenges to urban life. The story of Great Zimbabwe is ultimately a story about human adaptability, creativity, and determination. It's about people who looked at a landscape of granite hills and saw the possibility of creating something unprecedented. It's about communities that developed technologies and social structures that allowed them to overcome environmental limitations and create prosperity in an unlikely location. Most importantly, it's a story about the resilience of human culture and the ways that innovations and achievements can outlive the specific circumstances that created them. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe stand today as monuments not just to the people who built them, but to the enduring human capacity to create something beautiful and lasting even in the face of uncertainty and change. The city may have been abandoned, but its legacy continues to influence our understanding of what African civilizations achieved long before European contact, and what human communities can accomplish when they combine vision with determination and adapt creatively to the challenges of their environment. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe extends far beyond the stone walls that tourists visit today. In the centuries following the abandonment of the great city, the ripple effects of its innovations continued to reshape southern Africa in ways that would influence the region for generations to come. The techniques, technologies, and social structures that had been perfected during the height of the stone city's power didn't simply vanish when the last inhabitants departed. Instead, they spread throughout the region like seeds carried on the wind, taking root in new communities and evolving to meet different circumstances. The most visible legacy was architectural. Across what is now Zimbabwe, Botswana, and parts of South Africa, new stone-walled settlements began appearing in the 16th and 17th centuries. Each bore the unmistakable influence of Great Zimbabwe's building traditions, but each was also adapted to local conditions and needs. Kami, which had been established as a successor site during Great Zimbabwe's decline, became the capital of the Torwa state and grew into a major center in its own right. The builders of Kami took the basic principles of dry stone wall construction that had been perfected at Great Zimbabwe and refined them further, creating curved walls and elaborate decorative patterns that represented a new chapter in southern African architecture. Danangombe, another major stone settlement, demonstrated how the building techniques could be adapted to different landscapes and political structures. Located in what is now central Zimbabwe, this site featured massive stone platforms and terraced enclosures that showed clear influence from Great Zimbabwe, but were designed for a different kind of society. The rulers of Danangombe controlled different trade routes and different resources than their predecessors at Great Zimbabwe, and their architecture reflected these different circumstances while maintaining the essential principles of stone construction that had made the original city so remarkable. The spread of stone building technology wasn't limited to major political centers. Throughout the region, smaller communities began constructing their own stone enclosures, often on a much more modest scale, but following the same basic principles. These smaller sites, sometimes consisting of just a single circular wall enclosing a family compound, demonstrate how thoroughly the architectural innovations of Great Zimbabwe had penetrated regional culture. The knowledge of how to select, shape, and fit granite blocks had become part of the common heritage of southern African peoples. But the influence of Great Zimbabwe extended far beyond architecture. The political and social structures that had been developed to manage the complex society of the Stone City provided models that were adapted and modified throughout the region. The tribute system that had allowed Great Zimbabwe's rulers to control vast territories without maintaining a large standing army became a template for later African states. The combination of sacred authority and economic control that had legitimized the power of Great Zimbabwe's rulers influenced the development of kingship throughout southern Africa. The economic innovations were equally influential. The trading networks that had been established to move gold and ivory from the interior to the coast continued to operate long after Great Zimbabwe's decline, though they were now controlled by different centers. The techniques for processing gold that had been developed in the workshops of the Stone City spread to other mining areas, increasing the efficiency of gold production throughout the region. The cattle-raising methods that had supported Great Zimbabwe's pastoral economy influenced livestock management practices across southern Africa. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural and spiritual innovations that had emerged during Great Zimbabwe's heyday continued to shape regional beliefs and practices. The integration of ancestor worship with political authority that had been central to the ideology of the Stone City's rulers became a common feature of African political systems throughout the region. The artistic traditions that had flourished in Great Zimbabwe's workshops influenced decorative styles in pottery, metalwork, and textile production for centuries, after the city's abandonment. The oral traditions that preserved the memory of Great Zimbabwe also played a crucial role in maintaining cultural continuity. Stories about the Stone City and its rulers were passed down through generations of praise singers, historians, and ordinary people. These oral histories, while not always historically accurate in their details, preserved important cultural knowledge about political legitimacy, social organization, and the relationship between rulers and their subjects. They also maintained awareness of Great Zimbabwe as a symbol of African achievement and innovation. When European explorers and settlers first encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they found it almost impossible to believe that indigenous Africans had built such sophisticated structures. The racist assumptions of the colonial era led to elaborate theories about Phoenician, Arab, or even biblical origins for the Stone City. These theories persisted well into the 20th century, despite increasing archaeological evidence that Great Zimbabwe was undoubtedly the product of local African innovation and labor. The denial of African agency in the creation of Great Zimbabwe became part of the broader colonial project of justifying European domination of Africa. If Africans were capable of creating such sophisticated civilizations, then the colonial argument that Europeans were bringing civilization to a backward continent became much harder to sustain. The persistence of these racist interpretations delayed serious archaeological investigation of Great Zimbabwe for decades and contributed to the erasure of African historical achievements from popular consciousness. The struggle to reclaim the true history of Great Zimbabwe became an important part of African nationalism and the independence movement in what was then Southern Rhodesia. African intellectuals and political leaders pointed to Great Zimbabwe as evidence of their continent's rich historical heritage and their people's capacity for self-governance. The Stone City became a powerful symbol of African achievement and a rallying point for those fighting against colonial rule. When the country gained independence in 1980, the new nation chose to call itself Zimbabwe, taking its name from the ancient stone city that had once been the greatest settlement in the region. This wasn't simply a matter of adopting an African name to replace a colonial one. It was a deliberate statement about continuity between the modern nation and the historical civilizations that had flourished on the same territory centuries earlier. The bird carved in soapstone that had been found at Great Zimbabwe became the national emblem, appearing on the flag and currency of the new nation. Modern archaeological research has vindicated the claims of those who argued for the African origins of Great Zimbabwe. Sophisticated dating techniques, detailed analysis of artifacts, and careful study of architectural features have established beyond any doubt that the Stone City was built by the ancestors of the Shona people who still live in the region today. The pottery styles, the building techniques, and the cultural practices evidenced at Great Zimbabwe show clear continuities with local traditions that extend back centuries before the city's construction and continue to the present day. The archaeological evidence has also revealed the sophisticated nature of Great Zimbabwe's society in ways that earlier observers couldn't have imagined. The discovery of Chinese porcelain and Persian ceramics at the site demonstrated the extent of the city's international connections. The analysis of plant and animal remains has shown how the inhabitants adapted their agricultural and pastoral practices to support an urban population. The study of metalworking debris has revealed the technical sophistication of the city's craftspeople and their ability to work with both local and imported materials. Recent research has also begun to address some of the questions that have puzzled scholars for generations. New techniques for analyzing ancient DNA and studying plant remains have provided insights into the environmental changes that may have contributed to the city's eventual abandonment. Climate data extracted from tree rings and lake sediments has confirmed that the region experienced a period of increasing aridity during the late medieval period, that would have put enormous stress on the agricultural and pastoral systems that supported Great Zimbabwe's population. The study of Great Zimbabwe has also contributed to broader understanding of African history and the development of complex societies in sub-Saharan Africa. The Stone City stands as one of the most impressive examples of indigenous African urban development, demonstrating that sophisticated civilizations flourished in Africa long before European contact. The techniques and social structures developed at Great Zimbabwe influenced the development of other African societies and contributed to the rich diversity of political and cultural forms that characterized pre-colonial Africa. For visitors to Great Zimbabwe today, the stone walls offer a tangible connection to this remarkable heritage. Walking through the same passages that were once traveled by medieval African rulers, standing within enclosures where important ceremonies were conducted centuries ago, and touching stones that were carefully placed by skilled craftspeople, provides an immediate and powerful link to the past. The site serves as a reminder that Africa has a rich historical heritage that extends far beyond the colonial period and includes achievements that rival those of any civilization in the world. The conservation of Great Zimbabwe presents ongoing challenges that reflect broader issues facing archaeological sites throughout Africa. The stone walls, while remarkably durable, require careful maintenance to prevent damage from weather, vegetation, and human activity. The surrounding landscape faces pressure from development, agriculture, and mining that could potentially damage the archaeological record that still lies buried beneath the soil. Balancing the need to preserve this heritage for future generations with the practical needs of local communities requires ongoing effort and resources. Educational programs at Great Zimbabwe aim to ensure that both local communities and international visitors understand the significance of the site and its place in African and world history. School groups from throughout Zimbabwe visit the ruins to learn about their heritage and to understand the achievements of their ancestors. International visitors are encouraged to see Great Zimbabwe not as an isolated curiosity, but as part of the broader story of human civilization and African historical development. The research continues to yield new insights into the society that created Great Zimbabwe. Recent excavations have uncovered new areas of the settlement that were previously unknown, revealing additional evidence about how the city was organized and how its inhabitants lived. New analytical techniques applied to existing collections of artifacts are providing fresh insights into trade relationships, technological development, and social organization. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of this remarkable civilization and its place in African and world history. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe extends into the present day through the continuing traditions of the Shona people, who are its cultural descendants. Many of the social practices, religious beliefs, and cultural values that were central to life in the Stone City continue to influence Shona society today. The respect for ancestors, the importance of cattle in social and economic life, and the techniques of ironworking and pottery making all show continuities that stretch back to the medieval period and beyond. The stone walls themselves remain the most visible and impressive legacy of Great Zimbabwe, but they represent only a small part of what this civilization achieved. The innovations in agriculture, politics, trade, and social organization that emerged from the granite hills of Zimbabwe influenced the development of southern Africa for centuries and continue to shape the region today. The story of Great Zimbabwe is ultimately a story about human creativity, adaptability, and achievement that deserves its place among the great civilizations of world history. As night falls over the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, as it has for more than 5 centuries since the last inhabitants departed, the stone walls stand as silent witnesses to one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. They remind us that innovation and greatness can emerge from any place and any people, that human creativity knows no boundaries of geography or culture, and that the achievements of the past continue to inspire and inform the present. The story of Great Zimbabwe is far from over. It continues to evolve as new discoveries shed light on this remarkable civilization, and as new generations learn from its example of what human communities can accomplish when they combine vision with determination and wisdom with ambition. The mystery that has captivated archaeologists and historians for over a century isn't just about who built Great Zimbabwe or why it was abandoned. It's about how a civilization this sophisticated could have emerged in a region that European explorers dismissed as incapable of supporting complex societies. The answer lies in understanding that Great Zimbabwe wasn't an isolated achievement, but the culmination of centuries of gradual innovation, adaptation, and cultural development that had been unfolding across southern Africa long before the first stones were placed. To truly appreciate what made Great Zimbabwe possible, we need to step back and examine the broader patterns of human settlement and technological development that had been shaping this region for over 1,000 years. The Bantu-speaking peoples who eventually built the stone city hadn't simply appeared in southern Africa overnight. They were the descendants of farmers and ironworkers who had been gradually expanding southward from Central Africa over many generations, bringing with them sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and social organization. This migration wasn't a military conquest or a sudden displacement of existing populations. It was a slow process of cultural diffusion, intermarriage, and technological exchange that unfolded over centuries. The Bantu speakers brought new crops, new farming techniques, and new ways of organizing society. But they also learned from the hunter-gatherer peoples who had lived in southern Africa for thousands of years, adopting their knowledge of local plants, animals, and environmental conditions. The iron-working technology that these early Bantu speakers possessed was particularly crucial to their success. Iron tools allowed them to clear forests more efficiently, to till soil more effectively, and to harvest crops with greater productivity. Iron weapons gave them advantages in both hunting and warfare. Perhaps most importantly, iron working provided them with trade goods that were highly valued by communities throughout the region. A skilled blacksmith could support himself and his family by trading iron implements for food, cattle, and other necessities. But iron working required more than just technical knowledge. It demanded access to ore deposits, fuel for furnaces, and the social organization necessary to coordinate the complex process of smelting and forging. The communities that settled in the region around Great Zimbabwe were fortunate to have all of these resources in abundance. High-quality iron ore was available in nearby hills. Dense forests provided the charcoal needed for smelting. Most importantly, the agricultural surplus generated by their farming activities freed some community members to specialize in metalworking rather than spending all their time producing food. The pottery traditions that developed in this region during the early centuries of Bantu settlement also reveal sophisticated technical knowledge and artistic sensibility. The ceramics produced by these early communities weren't just functional vessels for cooking and storage. They were works of art that displayed complex decorative patterns, innovative shapes, and technical mastery of firing techniques. The pottery styles that emerged in different areas showed both local innovation and evidence of long-distance cultural exchange, suggesting that these communities were connected by trade networks that spanned hundreds of miles. The agricultural systems that supported these early communities were remarkably sophisticated, adapted to the specific environmental conditions of the southern African plateau. The farmers understood the importance of crop rotation, using different fields in different years to maintain soil fertility. They developed techniques for storing grain that could preserve harvests for years, protecting against the droughts that periodically affected the region. They learned to exploit different environmental zones, growing crops that required more water in river valleys while using the drier uplands for grazing cattle. Cattle played an increasingly important role in these societies as the communities grew larger and more prosperous. The animals provided milk, meat, and hides, but their significance extended far beyond their economic value. Cattle served as stores of wealth that could be accumulated during good times and converted to other resources during periods of scarcity. They were used in marriage negotiations, political alliances, and religious ceremonies. Most importantly, they became symbols of status and prestige that allowed successful individuals to distinguish themselves from their neighbors. The social structures that developed around cattle ownership created the foundation for the hierarchical societies that would eventually build Great Zimbabwe. Families that owned large herds gained influence over those with fewer animals. Wealthy cattle owners could afford to marry multiple wives, creating larger extended families that provided both labor and political support. They could loan cattle to less fortunate neighbors, creating relationships of obligation and dependence that extended their influence throughout the community. The religious and spiritual beliefs of these early communities also played a crucial role in preparing the ground for Great Zimbabwe's eventual emergence. The Bantu speakers brought with them strong traditions of ancestor worship, believing that the spirits of the dead continued to influence the world of the living. These ancestral spirits were thought to be particularly associated with specific places, especially hills, caves, and other distinctive landscape features that became sacred sites where important ceremonies were conducted. This connection between spiritual authority and specific locations would prove crucial to the development of Great Zimbabwe. The rulers who eventually built the stone city weren't just political and economic leaders. They were also spiritual intermediaries who claimed special relationships with the ancestral spirits that protected the community. By building their structures on sacred hills and incorporating natural rock formations into their walls, they were making powerful statements about their spiritual as well as temporal authority. The trade networks that connected these early communities also laid the foundation for Great Zimbabwe's later prosperity. Long before gold became the basis of international commerce, local communities were exchanging goods across hundreds of miles. Salt from coastal deposits was traded for iron tools from inland workshops. Pottery made by specialist craftspeople was exchanged for cattle raised by pastoral communities. Copper from northern mines was worked into jewelry and ceremonial objects that were distributed throughout the region. These early trade networks operated according to principles that would later be expanded and formalized during Great Zimbabwe's rise to power. Successful traders didn't just move goods from one place to another. They served as intermediaries who facilitated exchanges between communities with different specializations and different needs. They built relationships of trust with trading partners in distant regions. They developed knowledge of routes, markets, and seasonal patterns that gave them advantages over competitors. The environmental conditions that would later support Great Zimbabwe's growth were also being shaped during these early centuries. The agricultural activities of expanding farming communities were gradually transforming the landscape, clearing forests and creating grasslands that could support larger cattle herds. The iron-working activities were consuming vast quantities of wood for charcoal, further altering the vegetation patterns. The increasing human population was putting pressure on wild animal populations, making hunting less reliable and increasing the importance of domestic animals. These environmental changes weren't simply destructive. In many cases, they created conditions that were more favorable for human settlement and economic development. The grasslands created by forest clearing provided excellent grazing for cattle. The modification of drainage patterns through agricultural activities sometimes improved the reliability of water supplies. The reduction of wild animal populations decreased the risks faced by farmers and herders in outlying areas. The technological innovations that emerged during this period of gradual development would later be crucial to Great Zimbabwe's success. The stoneworking techniques that were eventually used to build the Great Walls began as simple methods for creating foundations and terraces. The organizational systems that were later used to coordinate massive construction projects evolved from the cooperative labor arrangements needed for agricultural activities. The accounting methods that were later used to manage complex trade networks developed from simple systems for tracking cattle ownership and grain storage. Perhaps most importantly, this period saw the emergence of the social and political institutions that would later enable Great Zimbabwe's rulers to coordinate the activities of thousands of people across vast territories. The principles of kinship and reciprocity that governed relationships within extended families were gradually extended to larger communities. The authority structures that managed village affairs were scaled up to coordinate activities across multiple settlements. The dispute resolution mechanisms that maintained peace within communities were adapted to handle conflicts between different groups. The accumulation of wealth during this period wasn't just about individual families becoming prosperous. It was about entire communities developing the resources and organizational capacity needed to undertake ambitious projects. The surplus agricultural production that freed some people to specialize in crafts or trade also created the foundation for supporting the non-productive activities like monumental construction. The cattle herds that served as stores of wealth also provided the transport animals needed to move heavy materials over long distances. The gradual development of specialized knowledge and skills was equally important. Master craftspeople emerged who understood the properties of different materials and the techniques needed to work them effectively. Experienced traders developed knowledge of distant markets and the skills needed to negotiate complex exchanges. Religious specialists learned the rituals and traditions that legitimized political authority and maintained social cohesion. By the beginning of the second millennium CE, all the elements were in place for something unprecedented in southern African history. The agricultural base was strong enough to support urban populations. The trade networks were extensive enough to generate substantial wealth. The social structures were sophisticated enough to coordinate large-scale activities. The technological knowledge was advanced enough to tackle ambitious construction projects. Most importantly, the cultural frameworks existed to justify and sustain the kind of centralized authority that would be needed to build and maintain a city like Great Zimbabwe. The transformation from scattered farming villages to a regional superpower didn't happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of gradual development, innovation, and adaptation. Each generation built upon the achievements of their predecessors, gradually creating the conditions that would make Great Zimbabwe possible. The stone walls that tourists admire today represent not just the ambitions of a single ruler or the achievements of a single generation, but the culmination of a long process of cultural and technological development that had been unfolding across southern Africa for nearly 1,000 years. Understanding this broader context helps explain both Great Zimbabwe's remarkable achievements and its eventual limitations. The civilization that built the stone city was working with technologies, social structures, and environmental knowledge that had been developed over many generations. They were incredibly sophisticated within the parameters of their time and place, but they were also constrained by factors that no amount of human ingenuity could completely overcome. The story of Great Zimbabwe is ultimately a story about human potential and human limitations, about what communities can achieve when they build upon the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. and about the challenges that even the most successful civilizations face when environmental and social conditions change beyond their ability to adapt. The rise of Great Zimbabwe to regional dominance was built upon something far more complex than just controlling gold deposits or establishing trade routes. It was fundamentally about creating a new kind of authority that blended political power, economic control, and spiritual legitimacy in ways that had never been attempted in southern Africa before. The rulers who emerged during the 13th century weren't simply successful farmers or traders who had accumulated enough wealth to build impressive walls. They were visionaries who understood how to transform material prosperity into lasting political institutions. The key to this transformation lay in their ability to control and redistribute resources on an unprecedented scale. Archaeological evidence from the early phases of Great Zimbabwe's expansion reveals a sophisticated system of resource management that went far beyond anything that had existed in the region before. Excavations in the storage areas of the hill complex have uncovered evidence of grain reserves that could have fed thousands of people for months. Cattle pens built into the hillsides show evidence of herds that numbered in the tens of thousands. Workshop areas reveal production of iron tools, copper ornaments, and pottery on an industrial scale. But this wasn't simply about accumulating wealth for its own sake. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe understood that their power depended on their ability to provide security, prosperity, and spiritual guidance to their followers. The massive stone walls served multiple functions in this regard. They were defensive structures that could protect the population during times of conflict. They were symbols of permanence and stability that attracted people from across the region. Most importantly, they were sacred spaces where the rulers could perform the rituals that legitimized their authority and maintained their connection to the ancestral spirits. The construction process itself became a powerful tool for consolidating political authority. Building the Great Walls required coordinating the activities of thousands of workers over periods that lasted for decades. Stone had to be quarried from specific sites where the granite had the right properties for construction. The blocks had to be shaped and transported to the building sites, often requiring teams of dozens of people to move the largest pieces. The actual construction required master masons who understood the complex engineering principles involved in building stable walls without mortar. Managing such a massive undertaking required organizational skills that went far beyond anything that had been necessary in the smaller communities of earlier centuries. Work gangs had to be coordinated so that different tasks were completed in the proper sequence. Food and water had to be provided for workers who were engaged in construction rather than food production. Tools and materials had to be manufactured and distributed to the appropriate teams. Most challenging of all, the entire project had to be planned and executed in ways that maintained worker morale and community support over the many years required for completion. The rulers who accomplished this feat weren't working alone. Archaeological evidence suggests that they were supported by a sophisticated administrative hierarchy that included specialists in different aspects of the construction process. Some officials were responsible for organizing labor gangs and ensuring that workers received appropriate compensation for their efforts. Others managed the logistics of moving materials and maintaining construction sites. Still others served as intermediaries with the spiritual authorities who determined where walls could be built and what rituals had to be performed during construction. The religious dimension of the construction process was particularly important in legitimizing the enormous investments of time and resources that the walls required. The local population had to be convinced that building these structures was not just about enhancing the ruler's prestige, but about fulfilling important spiritual obligations to the ancestors and the gods. The placement of walls had to follow principles that demonstrated respect for sacred sites and natural features that were believed to have spiritual significance. The integration of religious and political authority that characterized Great Zimbabwe's leadership was visible in every aspect of the city's development. The layout of the settlement followed cosmological principles that reflected beliefs about the relationship between the earthly and spiritual realms. The hill complex, positioned at the highest point of the settlement, served as the residence of the ruler, but also as the primary location for ceremonies that maintained the community's relationship with the ancestral spirits. The great enclosure in the valley below housed the practical activities of trade and craft production, but was also designed according to spiritual principles that ensured the prosperity and harmony of these economic activities. The daily life of the rulers themselves reflected this integration of temporal and spiritual responsibilities. Contemporary accounts preserved in oral traditions describe elaborate daily routines that combined administrative duties with religious observances. The ruler would begin each day with prayers and offerings at ancestral shrines within the hill complex. These morning rituals were believed to ensure that the decisions made during the day would have the support of the spiritual forces that protected the community. The administrative work that occupied much of the ruler's time involved making decisions about resource allocation, settling disputes between different communities, and planning military operations or construction projects. But even these apparently secular activities were conducted according to spiritual principles. Important decisions were made only after consulting with religious specialists who could interpret omens and divine the will of the ancestors. Disputes were settled not just according to practical considerations of justice and community harmony, but also according to spiritual principles that took into account the effects of different decisions on the relationships between the living and the dead. The evening hours were devoted to ceremonial activities that reinforced the ruler's role as the community's primary spiritual intermediary. These ceremonies often involved elaborate rituals conducted in the sacred enclosures of the hill complex, with participants drawn from the elite families who supported the ruler's authority. The ceremonies served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the ruler's special relationship with the spiritual forces that protected the community. They provided opportunities for the elite to reaffirm their loyalty and receive recognition for their contributions. And they created shared experiences that strengthened the bonds of identity and purpose that held the political system together. The economic foundation that supported this elaborate political and religious system was built upon innovations in trade organization that went far beyond anything that had existed in the region before. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe didn't simply control local gold deposits and trade them for foreign goods. They created a comprehensive commercial network that integrated production, processing, transportation, and marketing in ways that maximized the value extracted from every transaction. The gold processing facilities that have been excavated within the Great Enclosure reveal sophisticated techniques for extracting and refining the precious metal that were far more advanced than the simple panning methods used by earlier communities. Furnaces built with carefully designed ventilation systems could achieve the high temperatures needed for efficient smelting. Specialized tools allowed workers to separate gold from other minerals with remarkable precision. Most importantly, standardized procedures ensured consistent quality in the finished products that were prepared for export. The ivory workshops show similar innovations in processing techniques and quality control. Elephants hunted in the surrounding regions were brought to Great Zimbabwe, where skilled craftspeople carved the tusks into objects that met the specific requirements of different overseas markets. Some pieces were carved according to African aesthetic traditions for trade with other African communities. Others were designed according to specifications provided by Arab and Persian merchants who understood the preferences of customers in distant lands. The most valuable pieces incorporated gold and copper ornaments that demonstrated the technical skills of Great Zimbabwe's craftspeople, while creating products that commanded premium prices in international markets. The agricultural systems that supported this urban population were equally sophisticated, incorporating innovations that allowed much higher productivity than traditional farming methods could achieve. The terracing systems built on the hillsides around Great Zimbabwe weren't simply attempts to create more farmland. They were carefully engineered structures that controlled water flow, prevented soil erosion, and created microclimates that were optimal for different crops. Some terraces were designed for crops that required consistent moisture, with stone channels that directed water from springs and seasonal streams. Others were built for crops that thrived in drier conditions, with drainage systems that prevented waterlogging during the rainy season. The livestock management systems were equally advanced, incorporating techniques that maximized the productivity of cattle herds while minimizing the environmental impact of large-scale grazing. Herders employed rotational grazing practices that allowed grasslands to recover between periods of intensive use. They developed methods for improving pasture quality through controlled burning and selective seeding with preferred grass varieties. Most importantly, they created integrated systems that combined cattle raising with crop production, using animal manure to fertilize fields while using crop residues to supplement animal feed during dry seasons. The social structures that emerged to manage these complex economic activities created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility while maintaining the stability that large-scale enterprises required. Successful craftspeople could accumulate enough wealth to establish their own workshops and hire apprentices. Talented traders could build their own commercial networks and eventually compete with established merchant families. Even ordinary workers could improve their status by developing specialized skills that were valued in the urban economy. But this social mobility operated within clearly defined limits that preserved the authority of the ruling elite. The most lucrative activities remained under the direct control of the ruler and his immediate family. Access to gold deposits required official permission that was granted only to trusted allies. The most valuable trade relationships were managed by court officials who reported directly to the ruler. The spiritual knowledge that legitimized political authority was carefully guarded within the ruling lineage and shared only with selected religious specialists. The result was a dynamic but stable social system that channeled ambition and innovation in directions that strengthened rather than threatened the existing power structure. People who wanted to improve their circumstances had to work within the established system rather than challenging it directly. This created powerful incentives for cooperation and loyalty, while providing mechanisms for incorporating new talent and ideas into the ruling establishment. The cultural flowering that accompanied Great Zimbabwe's political and economic expansion created artistic and intellectual achievements that influenced the entire region. The pottery produced in the city's workshops reached new levels of technical sophistication and aesthetic refinement. Ceramic vessels were decorated with complex geometric patterns that reflected both local artistic traditions and influences from distant trading partners. The techniques developed for creating these decorative effects spread throughout southern Africa, influencing pottery traditions that continued for centuries after Great Zimbabwe's decline. The metalworking traditions achieved similar levels of excellence, producing objects that were both technically advanced and artistically sophisticated. Iron weapons and tools reached new standards of quality and durability. Copper and gold ornaments incorporated design elements that demonstrated the craftspeople's mastery of complex techniques for shaping and decorating precious metals. Most remarkably, bronze objects began appearing in archaeological contexts from this period, indicating that Great Zimbabwe's metalworkers had learned to create alloys that were unknown in the region before. The architectural innovations that characterized Great Zimbabwe's construction extended beyond the famous stone walls to include sophisticated engineering solutions for water management, waste disposal, and climate control. The drainage systems built into the foundations of major structures prevented water damage during the rainy season, while directing runoff to areas where it could be used for irrigation. Waste disposal systems kept residential areas clean and sanitary, while creating fertilizer that could be used in agricultural areas. Building designs incorporated features that provided natural ventilation and temperature control, creating comfortable living conditions even during the hottest parts of the year. The intellectual achievements of this period included advances in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that were necessary for planning and executing the massive construction projects that defined the city. The builders had to develop methods for calculating the quantities of materials needed for different structures, techniques for surveying and laying out building sites, and systems for coordinating the work of hundreds of craftspeople and laborers. The astronomical knowledge required for orienting buildings according to spiritual principles and seasonal cycles represented sophisticated understanding of celestial movements and their relationship to earthly activities. The oral traditions that flourished during this period preserved historical knowledge, cultural values, and technical information in forms that could be transmitted across generations without written records. Praise singers developed elaborate poetic traditions that celebrated the achievements of rulers and heroes while preserving information about political relationships and military campaigns. Storytellers created narratives that transmitted moral teachings and cultural values while entertaining audiences during community gatherings. Technical specialists developed mnemonic systems that preserved detailed knowledge about crafting techniques, agricultural practices, and religious rituals. The legal and administrative systems that govern this complex society represented sophisticated solutions to the challenges of maintaining order and justice in a large, diverse community. Legal codes developed through custom and precedent addressed everything from property rights and commercial disputes to criminal offenses and family conflicts. Administrative procedures established clear lines of authority and responsibility, while providing mechanisms for appeal and review of important decisions. Most importantly, these systems balanced the need for consistent standards with recognition of the different customs and traditions that existed among the various communities that made up Great Zimbabwe's population. The military organizations that protected Great Zimbabwe's interests and enforced its authority throughout the region combined traditional African warfare techniques with innovations that reflected the city's unique circumstances and resources. Warriors were equipped with high-quality iron weapons produced in the city's workshops. They were organized into specialized units that could function effectively in different types of terrain and against different types of opponents. Most importantly, they were trained and led by professional officers who understood both the tactical requirements of individual battles and the strategic considerations involved in maintaining control over a large territory. The diplomatic relationships that Great Zimbabwe maintained with neighboring communities and distant trading partners reflected sophisticated understanding of international relations and the factors that influenced political stability in the region. Treaties and alliances were negotiated according to principles that balanced immediate military and economic advantages with long-term considerations of regional security and commercial relationships. Marriage alliances between ruling families created bonds of kinship that strengthened political relationships while facilitating cultural and economic exchange. Trade agreements established rules and procedures that protected merchants while ensuring that Great Zimbabwe received appropriate compensation for providing security and facilitating commerce. The environmental management practices that sustained Great Zimbabwe's prosperity demonstrated remarkable understanding of ecological principles and the relationship between human activities and natural systems. Forest management programs ensured sustainable supplies of wood for construction and fuel, while maintaining the watersheds that provided reliable water sources. Wildlife conservation measures protected the animal populations that provided ivory and other trade goods, while maintaining the natural balance that supported the region's agricultural and pastoral systems. Soil conservation techniques prevented erosion and maintained fertility in the agricultural areas that fed the city's population. By 1350, Great Zimbabwe had become more than just a successful city or even a powerful state. It had evolved into a civilization that represented the culmination of centuries of African innovation and achievement. The institutions, technologies, and cultural traditions that had been developed within its stone walls influenced the entire southern African region and continued to shape local societies long after the city itself was abandoned. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe extended far beyond its physical remains to encompass ideas, techniques, and values that became part of the permanent heritage of African civilization. The end of Great Zimbabwe's dominance came not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the slow, inexorable forces of change that test every civilization's ability to adapt. As the 15th century unfolded, the stone city that had commanded the respect of a continent found itself facing challenges that no amount of wealth, wisdom, or determination could fully overcome. The very success that had made Great Zimbabwe the jewel of southern Africa was creating pressures that would ultimately transform it from a living city into a historical memory. The environmental stresses that had been building for generations reached a critical threshold during the early 1400s. The climate data preserved in tree rings and lake sediments tells a story of increasing unpredictability, with the reliable rainfall patterns that had sustained the region's agriculture giving way to cycles of drought and flood that made long-term planning nearly impossible. The springs that had provided water to the stone city during dry seasons began flowing less reliably, forcing inhabitants to dig deeper wells and travel farther to find adequate water sources. The agricultural terraces that had once been Great Zimbabwe's pride became increasingly difficult to maintain as soil exhaustion made them less productive. Generations of intensive cultivation had depleted the natural fertility of the land around the city, while the erosion caused by deforestation for construction and fuel was washing away the topsoil that remained. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had been built to support the urban population required constant maintenance that became more expensive and labor-intensive as environmental conditions deteriorated. The cattle herds that had been central to Great Zimbabwe's wealth and social structure faced even more severe challenges. The grasslands that had once supported tens of thousands of animals were showing signs of serious degradation from centuries of intensive grazing. The changing climate was altering the distribution and quality of pasture grasses, forcing herders to travel unprecedented distances to find adequate grazing for their animals. Many of the traditional dry-season grazing areas were becoming unreliable, creating competition and conflict between different herding communities. These environmental pressures were compounded by changes in the international trade networks that had made Great Zimbabwe wealthy. New gold discoveries in other parts of Africa were beginning to compete with the deposits that the Stone City had controlled for centuries. The Portuguese exploration of the African coast was creating alternative trade routes that bypassed the established networks connecting the interior to the Indian Ocean ports. Most significantly, the political situation along the coast was becoming increasingly unstable as different trading cities fought for control of the lucrative commercial relationships with overseas markets. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe recognized these challenges and attempted to respond with the same innovation and determination that had built their civilization. They established new trading posts closer to the coast, trying to maintain direct control over the export of gold and ivory. They negotiated new agreements with distant communities that controlled important grazing lands, offering political marriages and military support in exchange for access to pasture for their herds. They invested heavily in agricultural improvements, building new terraces and irrigation systems in areas where environmental conditions remained favorable. Perhaps most ambitiously, they began establishing what archaeologists call the successor sites, new stone-walled settlements built in different parts of the region, where conditions were more suitable for sustaining urban populations. Kami, located about 150 miles southwest of Great Zimbabwe, became the most important of these new centers. Built using architectural techniques that clearly derived from Great Zimbabwe but adapted to different environmental and political circumstances, Kami represented an attempt to recreate the success of the original stone city in a more sustainable location. The construction of these successor sites required enormous investments of resources at a time when Great Zimbabwe was already under stress. The skilled craftspeople, the transport animals, and the food supplies needed to support such massive construction projects had to be diverted from other activities. This created a difficult cycle where the responses to Great Zimbabwe's problems actually accelerated the city's decline by draining away the resources and people needed to maintain its existing infrastructure. The social and political structure of Great Zimbabwe was also evolving in response to these pressures. The original ruling family that had built the hill complex was no longer the only source of authority in the city. Wealthy merchant families, successful craftspeople, and the leaders of important trading expeditions had accumulated enough resources to challenge the traditional hierarchy. New stone enclosures were built throughout the settlement, each representing a different power center with its own followers and interests. This proliferation of competing elites created a more complex but also more unstable political environment. Decisions that had once been made by a single ruler and his advisors now required negotiation among multiple factions with different priorities. The consensus that had enabled Great Zimbabwe's early expansion became harder to maintain as different groups pursued conflicting strategies for dealing with the city's challenges. Some advocated for aggressive military expansion to secure new resources and trade routes. Others preferred diplomatic solutions that relied on negotiation and alliance building. Still others argued for a more conservative approach that focused on consolidating existing holdings rather than pursuing new opportunities. The religious and spiritual life of Great Zimbabwe was also affected by these changes. The traditional beliefs that had connected political authority to communication with the ancestors remained strong, but they were being supplemented by new spiritual practices that reflected the city's cosmopolitan character. Traders and immigrants brought religious ideas from across southern Africa and beyond, creating a more diverse but also more fragmented spiritual landscape. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the construction of new ceremonial structures within the Great Enclosure that incorporated decorative elements and architectural features, suggesting influence from other cultures. Some scholars interpret these changes as evidence of religious innovation and cultural synthesis. Others see them as signs that Great Zimbabwe was losing its distinctive identity as it became more integrated with wider trade networks and more dependent on resources from distant communities. The daily lives of ordinary people in Great Zimbabwe during this period of transition reveal a community that was adapting creatively to changing circumstances while struggling to maintain its distinctive character. The pottery from this era shows interesting innovations, with new decorative styles that suggest influence from other regions, but also demonstrate continued local creativity. The metalworking traditions continued to evolve, producing objects that were technically sophisticated, but stylistically different from earlier periods. The workshops that had been central to Great Zimbabwe's prosperity were adapting to changing conditions with characteristic ingenuity, gold processing techniques became more sophisticated as the easily accessible deposits near the city were exhausted, and miners had to work deeper and more remote sites. Ironworking evolved to produce not just tools and weapons, but increasingly complex decorative objects that demonstrated the skill of the city's craftspeople. Pottery production expanded to include items clearly intended for export, suggesting that Great Zimbabwe was beginning to compete in markets that had previously been dominated by coastal manufacturers. The architecture of the city itself continued to evolve during this period, with new walls and enclosures built using techniques that had been refined over generations of construction. But the scale of these projects was generally smaller than the massive undertakings of earlier centuries. Resources that had once been devoted to monumental construction were increasingly directed toward more practical concerns like food storage, water management, and defensive preparations. The defensive preparations are particularly significant because they suggest that Great Zimbabwe's rulers were becoming concerned about external threats. Earlier construction had focused primarily on creating impressive displays of wealth and power. The walls were tall and beautiful, but they had many openings and weren't designed primarily for military defense. The later construction shows evidence of more serious attention to defensive considerations, with fewer entrances, higher walls, and more strategic positioning of guard posts. These defensive concerns weren't unfounded paranoia. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing evidence of conflict throughout the region. Settlements that had been peaceful trading partners for generations were fortifying themselves against raids. Trade routes that had been secure for centuries were becoming dangerous as environmental pressures created competition for increasingly scarce resources. The political stability that had enabled Great Zimbabwe's rise was beginning to break down as communities throughout the region faced similar challenges. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe responded to these external threats with a combination of military expansion and diplomatic negotiation. They established new outposts in strategic locations to protect trade routes and assert control over important resources. They negotiated new alliances with communities that had previously been independent, offering protection and trade opportunities in exchange for loyalty and tribute. They invested heavily in military equipment and training, creating what may have been Southern Africa's first professional army equipped with standardized weapons and organized according to disciplined command structures. But these military solutions, while rational and well executed, couldn't address the fundamental problems facing Great Zimbabwe. The city had grown beyond the carrying capacity of its local environment, and the regional system that had supported its expansion was breaking down under environmental and economic pressures that affected the entire area. The trade networks that had generated its wealth were facing competition and instability that threatened future prosperity. Most critically, the political and social systems that had enabled its remarkable growth were struggling to adapt to changing conditions that required different approaches and different priorities. The population of Great Zimbabwe began to decline during the late 15th century as families made increasingly difficult decisions about their future. Some moved to the successor sites that had been established by the city's rulers, hoping to recreate their prosperity in more favorable locations. Others returned to the smaller communities where their families had originated before the rise of the Stone City, abandoning urban life for the more sustainable patterns of rural agriculture and pastoralism. Still others migrated to coastal areas where new trading opportunities were emerging with the arrival of Portuguese merchants. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual process that unfolded over several generations. Different areas of the settlement were abandoned at different times, with the population gradually concentrating in the most defensible and sustainable locations before eventually departing entirely. The hill complex, which had been the original center of power, appears to have been occupied longer than other areas, perhaps because its elevated position and natural water sources made it more viable during periods of stress. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final abandonment of the hill complex occurred sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century. The last inhabitants appear to have left in an orderly fashion, taking their most valuable possessions but leaving behind pottery, tools, and other everyday objects that provide intimate glimpses into their daily lives. There's no evidence of violent destruction or hasty evacuation. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a community that made a deliberate decision to relocate after carefully considering their options. The reasons for this final departure were probably similar to those that had been driving population movements for decades, but intensified to the point where remaining was no longer viable. The agricultural potential of the immediate area had been exhausted, and restoring it would have required investments of time and resources that the declining population couldn't afford. The cattle herds had been moved so far away that maintaining them required permanent residence in distant pastures. The trade networks that had supported the city's economy had shifted to other centers that were better positioned to take advantage of changing commercial opportunities. Most importantly, the political authority that had once drawn people from across the region to acknowledge the supremacy of Great Zimbabwe's rulers had been dispersed among multiple competing centers. The successor sites established by the city's former rulers were now independent powers in their own right. Other communities throughout the region had developed their own stone-building capabilities and trade relationships. The unique advantages that had once made Great Zimbabwe indispensable to the regional economy had been replicated or superseded by developments elsewhere. The people who left Great Zimbabwe didn't simply disappear into historical obscurity. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that they joined existing communities throughout the region or established new settlements in areas with better environmental conditions. Many probably moved to Kami and other successor sites that continued to flourish for centuries after Great Zimbabwe's abandonment. Others likely returned to areas where their families had originated before the rise of the Stone City, bringing with them the skills, knowledge, and cultural traditions they had developed during their urban experience. The cultural and technological innovations that had been developed at Great Zimbabwe continued to influence the region long after the city itself was abandoned. Stone-building techniques spread throughout southern Africa, with new settlements constructed according to principles that had been perfected in the granite hills of Zimbabwe. The political and social structures that had been developed to manage the complex society of the Stone City were adapted and modified by communities across the region. The agricultural and pastoral techniques that had supported Great Zimbabwe's population continued to be used and refined by farmers and herders throughout southern Africa. The artistic and craftwork traditions that had flourished in Great Zimbabwe's workshops also survived the city's abandonment, carried forward by the skilled artisans who relocated to other centers. The pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and decorative arts that had been developed in the Stone City influenced regional traditions for centuries. Some of these artistic influences can still be traced in the work of contemporary craftspeople in Zimbabwe and neighboring countries, creating direct links between modern African art and the cultural achievements of medieval Great Zimbabwe. The oral traditions that preserved the memory of Great Zimbabwe played a crucial role in maintaining cultural continuity after the city's abandonment. Stories about the Stone City and its rulers were passed down through generations of praise singers, historians, and ordinary people. These oral histories, while not always historically accurate in their details, preserved important cultural knowledge about political legitimacy, social organization, and the relationship between rulers and their subjects. They also maintained awareness of Great Zimbabwe as a symbol of African achievement and a reminder of what indigenous communities could accomplish when they combined vision with determination. The environmental recovery that began after Great Zimbabwe's abandonment demonstrates the resilience of natural systems when human pressure is reduced. Archaeological evidence suggests that forests began regenerating in areas where they had been cleared for agriculture and construction. Grasslands recovered their productivity as grazing pressure decreased. Water sources that had been stressed by urban demand began flowing more reliably. This environmental recovery created conditions that would eventually support new forms of human settlement, though none would match the scale and complexity of the original stone city. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe extends far beyond the stone walls that remain standing today. The techniques, technologies, and social structures that were developed during the city's centuries of prosperity influenced the development of African societies throughout the region and continue to shape local communities in more subtle ways. The architectural principles that were perfected in the granite hills of Zimbabwe can be seen in traditional building techniques still used by rural communities. The agricultural innovations that supported the city's population continue to influence farming practices. The social and political concepts that emerged from the complex urban society of Great Zimbabwe have contributed to the rich diversity of African political traditions. Most importantly, Great Zimbabwe stands as proof of what African civilizations achieved long before European contact. The sophistication of its technology, the complexity of its social organization, and the extent of its international connections demonstrate that Africa was home to advanced civilizations that rivaled those of any other continent. The racist assumptions that once denied African agency in creating Great Zimbabwe have been thoroughly refuted by archaeological evidence. But the broader significance of the site extends beyond correcting historical misconceptions. Great Zimbabwe represents human creativity, adaptability, and ambition operating within the constraints of a particular time and place. The people who built the stone city weren't superhuman. They were farmers, herders, craftspeople, and traders who saw opportunities in their environment and had the vision and determination to pursue them. Their achievements were remarkable not because they transcended human limitations, but because they showed what ordinary people could accomplish when they worked together toward common goals and adapted creatively to the challenges they faced. The story of Great Zimbabwe's rise and eventual abandonment also offers important lessons about the relationship between human societies and their environment. The civilization that built the stone city achieved remarkable prosperity by learning to work with the natural conditions of their region. But they also discovered the limits of what any environment can sustain. Their experience demonstrates both the possibilities and the constraints that have shaped human development throughout history. As we drift toward sleep, thinking about the wind that still whispers through those ancient granite hills, we can imagine the voices of the people who once called Great Zimbabwe home. The stone walls they built with such care and skill continue to stand as monuments to their vision and determination. The artifacts they left behind tell stories of daily life in one of Africa's greatest cities. The innovations they developed continue to influence the region they once ruled. Great Zimbabwe may have been abandoned as a living city, but it lives on in the heritage of Southern Africa and in the broader story of human achievement. The people who built those magnificent walls created something that has outlasted their own civilization, something that continues to inspire wonder and respect more than 5 centuries after the last inhabitants departed. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest achievement of any civilization: to create something beautiful and meaningful that endures long after its creators have joined the ancestors. Something that reminds future generations of what human beings can accomplish when they dare to dream of building something greater than themselves. The mystery that surrounds the abandonment of Great Zimbabwe has captivated scholars for generations. But perhaps the real enigma lies not in why the city was eventually abandoned, but in how profoundly it transformed the cultural DNA of an entire region. When the last families departed those granite hills, they carried with them something far more valuable than the gold they had once traded or the cattle that had symbolized their wealth. They carried the memory of what was possible. Picture the children who had grown up within those stone walls, who had played in the shadow of the great enclosure and learned their lessons from elders who remembered when the city was the beating heart of a continental empire. These children became the storytellers, the craftspeople, the leaders who would shape communities across southern Africa for generations to come. They had witnessed firsthand that Africans could build monuments to rival any civilization on Earth, that indigenous knowledge could create technologies sophisticated enough to support urban populations, that African political systems could coordinate activities across territories spanning thousands of miles. The psychological impact of this knowledge cannot be overstated. In societies where oral tradition serves as the primary repository of cultural memory, the stories of Great Zimbabwe became powerful reminders of African capability and achievement. When European colonizers later arrived with claims that Africans were incapable of complex civilization, they encountered communities whose collective memory included detailed accounts of the stone city and its accomplishments. These memories provided a foundation of cultural pride and historical awareness that proved remarkably resistant to colonial attempts at cultural erasure. The influence extended far beyond mere storytelling. The administrative systems that had been developed to manage Great Zimbabwe's complex urban society provided templates that were adapted by communities throughout the region. The principles of resource allocation, the methods for resolving disputes between different groups, the techniques for maintaining order in diverse populations, all became part of a shared knowledge base that influenced political development across southern Africa. Consider the sophisticated understanding of environmental management that had been developed during Great Zimbabwe's centuries of prosperity. The techniques for sustainable agriculture, the methods for managing water resources, the principles of forest conservation, all represented accumulated wisdom about living successfully in the challenging conditions of the southern African plateau. This knowledge spread throughout the region as Great Zimbabwe's former inhabitants established new communities and shared their expertise with local populations. The metallurgical innovations that had been perfected in Great Zimbabwe's workshops continued to influence ironworking throughout southern Africa. The techniques for smelting high-quality iron, the methods for creating specialized tools and weapons, the artistic traditions that transformed functional objects into works of beauty, all became part of a technological heritage that enhanced the capabilities of communities across the region. Archaeological evidence shows that ironworking techniques derived from Great Zimbabwe's traditions spread as far north as the Zambezi River and as far south as the Limpopo. The architectural knowledge was perhaps even more influential. The principles of dry stone wall construction that had been developed at Great Zimbabwe were adapted to local conditions throughout southern Africa, creating a distinctive regional building tradition that can still be observed today. Communities learned to work with their local stone types, to adapt the basic techniques to different climates and terrains, to incorporate the aesthetic principles that had made Great Zimbabwe's walls so beautiful into their own more modest constructions. The trading networks that had been established during Great Zimbabwe's period of dominance didn't simply disappear when the city was abandoned. Many of the relationships that had been built up over generations of commercial interaction continued to operate, though now they were managed by different centers and served different purposes. The routes that had once carried gold and ivory to the coast continued to facilitate the movement of goods and people throughout the region. The commercial relationships that had connected distant communities remained active, though they now operated according to different principles and served different political structures. The cultural synthesis that had occurred at Great Zimbabwe, where traditions from across southern Africa had been blended into new forms of artistic expression, also continued to influence regional development. The pottery styles, the textile traditions, the musical forms, the oral literature, all showed the ongoing influence of the cosmopolitan culture that had flourished in the Stone City. Communities throughout the region incorporated elements of this cultural heritage into their own traditions, creating new syntheses that reflected both local characteristics and the broader influence of Great Zimbabwe's cultural innovations. The religious and spiritual concepts that had been central to Great Zimbabwe's political system also spread throughout the region, though they were adapted to different circumstances and needs. The integration of ancestor worship with political authority, the connection between sacred sites and political power, the role of ritual in legitimizing leadership, all became common features of Southern African political systems. The specific forms varied from community to community, but the underlying principles showed clear influence from the model that had been developed at Great Zimbabwe. Even the languages of the region showed the influence of Great Zimbabwe's cosmopolitan character. The Shona dialects that had emerged during the city's period of prosperity continued to evolve and spread, carrying with them vocabulary and concepts that reflected the sophisticated urban culture of the Stone City. Terms related to trade, to political administration, to architectural techniques, to religious practices, all bore the linguistic fingerprints of Great Zimbabwe's influence on regional culture. The educational systems that had been developed to train the skilled craftspeople and administrators needed for Great Zimbabwe's complex society also left lasting legacies. The methods for transmitting technical knowledge, the principles for organizing apprenticeship programs, the techniques for preserving and passing on specialized skills, all influenced how communities throughout the region approached the challenge of maintaining and developing their technological capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, Great Zimbabwe had demonstrated the possibility of African unity and cooperation on an unprecedented scale. The tribute system that had connected communities across thousands of miles had shown that African societies could work together for mutual benefit, that regional integration was possible despite differences in language, culture, and local traditions. This model of cooperation would prove influential in later periods when communities faced new challenges that required coordinated responses. The military innovations that had been developed to protect Great Zimbabwe's interests also spread throughout the region. The organizational principles that had enabled the coordination of large military forces, the tactical innovations that had been developed for fighting in different terrains, the weapons technologies that had been perfected in the city's workshops, all became part of a shared military heritage that enhanced the defensive capabilities of communities throughout southern Africa. The legal systems that had been developed to maintain order in Great Zimbabwe's diverse urban population also influenced regional development. The principles for resolving disputes between people from different cultural backgrounds, the methods for protecting individual rights while maintaining community cohesion, the techniques for adapting traditional laws to the needs of complex societies, all provided models that were adapted by communities throughout the region. The diplomatic traditions that had enabled Great Zimbabwe to maintain relationships with communities across vast distances also left lasting influences. The protocols for negotiating agreements between different groups, the methods for maintaining long-distance communication, the principles for building trust between communities with different interests, all became part of a shared diplomatic heritage that facilitated cooperation throughout the region. When Portuguese explorers first encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the 16th century, they found not just abandoned stone walls, but a region whose entire cultural landscape had been shaped by the innovations and achievements of the Stone City. The communities they met were the inheritors of Great Zimbabwe's legacy, carrying forward the knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions that had been developed during the city's centuries of prosperity. The oral histories that preserved the memory of Great Zimbabwe weren't simply nostalgic reminiscences about a glorious past. They were active cultural resources that continued to shape how communities understood themselves and their possibilities. The stories of what had been achieved at Great Zimbabwe provided inspiration for new achievements, proof that African communities could accomplish remarkable things when they worked together with vision and determination. The artistic traditions that had flourished in Great Zimbabwe's workshops continued to evolve and develop in new locations. The aesthetic principles that had been refined during the city's cultural flowering influenced artistic development throughout the region. The technical skills that had been developed by the city's craftspeople were passed down through generations of artists and artisans who adapted them to new circumstances and new materials. The agricultural innovations that had supported Great Zimbabwe's urban population continued to influence farming practices throughout the region. The techniques for terracing hillsides, the methods for managing irrigation systems, the principles for maintaining soil fertility, all became part of a shared agricultural heritage that enhanced food production capabilities across southern Africa. The understanding of trade and commerce that had been developed during Great Zimbabwe's period of prosperity also continued to influence economic development throughout the region. The principles for organizing markets, the methods for establishing commercial relationships, the techniques for managing complex transactions, all provided foundations for continued economic growth and development. As the centuries passed and new challenges emerged, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe provided communities throughout southern Africa with cultural resources that helped them adapt and survive. When the slave trade began to devastate coastal communities, inland societies drew on the defensive strategies and organizational principles that had been developed during Great Zimbabwe's era. When colonial powers began to impose their authority over the region, African communities could draw on the memory of Great Zimbabwe as proof that they had their own rich heritage of political and technological achievement. The influence of Great Zimbabwe extended even into the modern era, when African nations gained independence and began the process of rebuilding their societies according to their own values and priorities. The example of Great Zimbabwe provided evidence that African societies had their own traditions of sophisticated political organization, that indigenous knowledge systems were capable of supporting complex civilizations, that African communities had their own rich heritage of technological and cultural innovation. Today, as communities throughout southern Africa work to address the challenges of development while maintaining their cultural identities, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe continues to provide inspiration and guidance. The stone walls that still stand in the granite hills of Zimbabwe serve as reminders of what African communities achieved in the past and what they might accomplish in the future. The story of Great Zimbabwe ultimately transcends the specific historical circumstances of its rise and fall. It speaks to universal human themes of ambition and achievement, of adaptation and resilience, of the eternal tension between growth and sustainability. The people who built those magnificent stone walls were grappling with challenges that remain relevant today, seeking solutions to problems that continue to face human communities everywhere. Their achievements remind us that innovation and greatness can emerge from any place and any people, that human creativity knows no boundaries of geography or culture, and that the accomplishments of the past continue to inspire and inform the present. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe lives on not just in the stone walls that tourists visit today, but in the ongoing story of human achievement and the eternal quest to build something beautiful and lasting in an uncertain world. As the African dawn breaks over those ancient granite hills, as it has for more than 5 centuries since the last inhabitants departed, the stones themselves seem to whisper the names of those who placed them there with such care and skill. Their voices join the wind that carries the memory of great Zimbabwe across the vast landscape of southern Africa, reminding all who listen that the human spirit, once awakened to its own possibilities, can create monuments that outlast empires and inspire generations yet to come. The whispers of those ancient voices carry us to a profound realization about human achievement and the eternal cycle of rise and renewal. Great Zimbabwe stands as perhaps the most powerful testament to a fundamental truth that transcends time itself. Civilizations may fade, cities may be abandoned, empires may crumble into dust, but the human capacity for greatness, once unleashed, creates ripples that spread across centuries. When we consider the full arc of Great Zimbabwe's story, from the first farmers who recognized the potential of those granite hills to the final families who made the difficult decision to seek new homes elsewhere, we witness something extraordinary. We see humanity at its most creative, most ambitious, most resilient. The people who built those stone walls weren't superhuman beings blessed with divine powers. They were ordinary individuals who dared to envision something extraordinary and then committed themselves to making it real. Their achievement challenges every assumption about what was possible in medieval Africa. They created architectural marvels without machinery, established trade networks spanning continents without modern transportation, developed sophisticated agricultural systems without industrial fertilizers, and maintained complex urban societies without written constitutions. They accomplished all of this through the application of human intelligence, determination, and cooperation on a scale that few civilizations have matched. The techniques they developed for working with granite demonstrate an intimate understanding of natural materials that modern engineers still admire. The social systems they created for managing diverse populations offer insights into governance that remain relevant today. The economic structures they established for facilitating long-distance trade show remarkable sophistication in their understanding of market dynamics and resource allocation. Perhaps most remarkably, they maintained their civilization for nearly 3 centuries while adapting continuously to changing environmental and political conditions. This wasn't a static society frozen in traditional patterns, but a dynamic culture that embraced innovation while preserving core values. They showed that it's possible to honor ancestral wisdom while pursuing new opportunities, to maintain cultural identity while engaging with global networks, to build impressive monuments while remaining sensitive to environmental constraints. The gradual abandonment of Great Zimbabwe teaches us equally important lessons about the relationship between human ambition and natural limits. Even the most successful civilizations must eventually confront the reality that all environments have carrying capacities, all resources have boundaries, all systems have breaking points. The people of Great Zimbabwe discovered these limits not through failure of vision or lack of effort, but through the inevitable consequences of sustained success. Their response to these challenges demonstrates remarkable wisdom and courage. Rather than clinging desperately to a situation that was no longer sustainable, they made the difficult decision to seek new opportunities elsewhere. They abandoned their stone city not in defeat, but in recognition that true success sometimes requires the courage to begin again. They carried with them the most valuable possessions any people can have: their knowledge, skills, cultural traditions, and memories of what they had accomplished together. The dispersal of Great Zimbabwe's population throughout southern Africa ensured that their innovations would continue to influence the region for centuries. Like seeds scattered by the wind, Their techniques, technologies, and cultural practices took root in new communities and evolved to meet different circumstances. The stone-building traditions spread across the landscape. The agricultural innovations enhanced food production in numerous locations. The political concepts influenced governance systems throughout the region. This pattern of cultural diffusion demonstrates one of the most important aspects of human civilization. Knowledge and innovation don't disappear when specific communities decline. Instead, they become part of the broader heritage of humanity, preserved and transmitted through the movement of people and the sharing of ideas. The achievements of Great Zimbabwe became part of the common patrimony of Southern Africa, enriching communities far from the original stone city. The oral traditions that preserved the memory of Great Zimbabwe played a crucial role in maintaining cultural continuity across the centuries. These stories weren't merely entertainment or nostalgic reminiscence. They were active repositories of knowledge that continued to shape how people understood themselves and their possibilities. The tales of what had been accomplished at the Stone City provided proof that African communities could achieve remarkable things when they combined vision with determination. When European colonizers later arrived with claims about African incapacity for complex civilization, they encountered societies whose collective memory included detailed accounts of Great Zimbabwe's achievements. These memories provided a foundation of cultural pride and historical awareness that proved remarkably resistant to colonial attempts at erasure. The stone walls themselves stood as silent witnesses to African achievement, impossible to dismiss or explain away. The rediscovery of Great Zimbabwe's true history in the modern era has had profound implications for understanding African civilization and human development more broadly. The archaeological evidence has definitively established that this remarkable city was the product of indigenous African innovation and labor. The sophistication of its technology, the complexity of its social organization, and the extent of its international connections demonstrate that Africa was home to advanced civilizations that rivaled those of any other continent. This recognition has helped correct centuries of historical distortion and cultural prejudice. It has restored to African peoples the knowledge of their own rich heritage of achievement and innovation. It has shown the world that human creativity and ambition have flourished in every corner of the globe, that remarkable civilizations have emerged from every cultural tradition, that greatness knows no boundaries of race or geography. The lessons of Great Zimbabwe extend far beyond the specific circumstances of medieval Southern Africa. The story speaks to universal human themes that remain relevant in our contemporary world. The challenges of balancing economic growth with environmental sustainability, of managing diverse populations within unified political systems, of maintaining cultural identity while engaging with global networks, of adapting traditional practices to changing circumstances, all remain central to human experience today. The people who built Great Zimbabwe faced many of the same fundamental questions that confront us now. How do we create prosperity while protecting the environment that sustains us? How do we build inclusive societies that respect diversity while maintaining cohesion? How do we preserve valuable traditions while embracing beneficial innovations? How do we balance local needs with global opportunities? Their responses to these challenges offer insights that transcend their specific historical context. Their example also demonstrates the importance of long-term thinking in human affairs. The builders of Great Zimbabwe planned for generations, not just years. They created institutions designed to endure across centuries. They invested in infrastructure that would benefit their children's children. They understood that true achievement requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to work for goals that extend beyond individual lifetimes. As we face our own contemporary challenges, the memory of Great Zimbabwe reminds us that human beings have repeatedly proven capable of remarkable achievements when they work together with shared purpose and determination. The stone walls that still stand in those granite hills serve as monuments not just to a specific civilization, but to the enduring human capacity for greatness. The wind that whispers through those ancient ruins carries more than just the memory of a lost city. It carries the promise that human creativity, ambition, and cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that the achievements of the past can inspire and guide the accomplishments of the future. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the story of Great Zimbabwe remind you that within every individual, within every community, within every generation, lies the potential for greatness. The same human qualities that built those magnificent stone walls continue to exist today, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be channeled toward new achievements, waiting to create new monuments to human possibility. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe lives on in every act of courage, every expression of creativity, every moment of cooperation that brings people together in pursuit of something greater than themselves. The stone city may have been abandoned, but its spirit endures wherever human beings dare to dream of building something beautiful and lasting in an uncertain world. Sleep well and dream of the endless possibilities that await when human vision meets human determination. When communities unite around shared goals, when the wisdom of the past guides the innovations of the future. The story of Great Zimbabwe is ultimately our story, the eternal human story of rise and renewal, of challenge and achievement, of the endless quest to build something worthy of our highest aspirations.